Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Outside the walls of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, the Romans crucified so many people, up to 500 a day, that they literally ran out of wood.
Yeah, the hills surrounding the city were completely stripped bare.
Right, turned into a massive, horrifying forest of crosses, meant to inflict absolute psychological terror on the starving defenders inside. It is just an apocalyptic scene.
It really is.
But the true historical anomaly here isn't just the sheer scale of the horror or even the destruction of the city. It is the fact that the culture trapped inside those walls somehow survived it.
Which, completely defies the standard historical model.
Yeah.
Usually when an empire systematically eradicates the geographic and religious center of an ancient people, razing their capital, burning their central sanctuary.
Enslaving the survivors, right?
Exactly. That culture vanishes. They assimilate into the conquering civilization, or they just fade into the footnotes of history.
But the events that took place in the Roman province of Judea between 66 CE and 136 CE threw that entire rulebook out the window. So today we are doing a deep dive into the Jewish-Roman Wars.
This is a series of three massive, devastating conflicts between a relatively small province and the absolute apex of Roman imperial might.
And if you are listening to this right now, the core question we want you to keep in the back of your mind is this. How does a culture survive when its physical and spiritual center is completely erased?
Because understanding the brutality of these wars is the only way to understand how a localized, temple-dependent religion managed to rewrite its own internal logic.
Right, to become the resilient, portable tradition that still exists today. But to make sense of the bloodshed, we have to rewind a bit. We need to look at the deeply entrenched tensions that made this explosion inevitable.
Yeah, because the occupation that triggered these wars did not begin with a sudden invasion in 66 CE. The groundwork was actually laid more than a century earlier in 63 BCE.
That is when the Roman Republic first entangled itself in Judean affairs, right?
Yeah.
Through the Roman general Pompey.
Exactly. At the time, Judea was an independent kingdom ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty. But that kingdom was tearing itself apart in a bitter civil war between two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus.
Both of them vying for the throne and the high priesthood.
Right.
And as often happens in history, when two sides in a civil war ask a massive empire for help, the empire just decides to take over.
Pretty much. Pompey marches his legions into Judea, officially intervening to settle the dispute, but he ends up laying siege to the fortified Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where Aristobulus' supporters are holding out.
And Pompey utilizes a formidable Roman engineering, right? Building a massive siege bank and bringing up battering rams.
He does. And when the walls finally fell, Pompey, acting as the victorious Roman conqueror, made a decision that set a deeply ominous tone for the next 2 centuries.
Right.
He, along with his entourage, walked directly into the Holy of Holies inside the Second Temple.
For anyone not familiar with the architecture of the Second Temple, you have to understand the spatial hierarchy here. The Temple Mount wasn't just one big building.
Right. It was highly stratified.
Yeah, it was a series of increasingly restricted zones. You had the massive outer court of the Gentiles where anyone could walk, trade, exchange money. Then, moving inward and upward, you had the court of the women, then the court of the Israelites for the men, and then the court of the priests.
Which is where the actual massive stone altar for animal sacrifices stood.
Exactly. And beyond the altar stood the sanctuary itself, which housed the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum.
And this space was entirely empty.
Right.
Which physically manifested the Jewish belief in a formless, invisible, transcendent God. There was no statue, no idol. Under Jewish law, only one human being, the high priest, was permitted to enter this space.
And he could only do so on one specific day of the year.
Yes, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to offer incense and seek forgiveness for the nation.
So picture the sheer arrogance of Pompey. He expects to walk in, pull back the heavy curtain, and find a massive golden statue of a local deity, just like he would in a Greek or Egyptian temple.
But instead, he finds an empty room.
Right. He doesn't loot it, which is notable, but just by stomping his boots into that sacred space, he commits the ultimate religious violation.
It communicated to the local population that Rome respected nothing but power. From that moment, in 63 BCE, Judea lost its independence and became a Roman client state.
And it underwent a gradual reduction in status until the year 6 CE, when the Romans deposed the local client rulers entirely.
Yeah, and placed Judea under direct Roman administration,
Direct rule meant that Roman prefects, or procurators, were stationed permanently in the province.
bringing Roman military and administrative culture into daily, highly abrasive contact with the local population.
And that contact was basically a fundamental clash of worldviews, wasn't it?
It really was. You have Jewish strict monotheism and aniconism, the absolute prohibition of religious images or idols. And they are running headfirst into Roman polytheism and the imperial cult, where the Roman state and eventually the emperors themselves were venerated as divine protectors.
The Romans genuinely struggled to comprehend the Jewish refusal to participate in the imperial cult, didn't they?
Oh, entirely. In the Roman mind, adding a quick sacrifice to the emperor's genius or his guiding spirit was simply basic civic duty.
It was the ancient equivalent of pledging allegiance to the flag.
Exactly. It demonstrated loyalty to the empire that provided roads, aqueducts, and security.
But to the Jewish population, that wasn't civic duty. It was idolatry. It was a direct violation of the Ten Commandments. You cannot worship a man, and you cannot offer incense to an image.
Right, this wasn't a minor cultural misunderstanding. It was a non-negotiable theological red line.
And the sources detail specific flashpoints where Roman administrators just bulldozed right over that line. Pontius Pilate is a perfect example of this administrative blindness.
Yes. Pilate served as the Roman prefect from 26 to 36 CE. Jerusalem was a growing city, and it desperately needed improved infrastructure, specifically water,
So Pilate decided to build an aqueduct.
which was a standard Roman public works project. The problem was how he funded it. He seized a massive sum of money, 17 talents, directly from the temple treasury.
Right, and if you are looking at this from Pilate's perspective, it probably seemed perfectly rational. He is sitting there thinking, there's a massive vault of gold just sitting idle in this temple, and the city needs water to prevent disease. I'm going to use those funds to build something useful.
Because the Roman administrative mindset prioritized public utility above all else.
Exactly. But to the Jewish population, those funds were not a generic civic treasury. They were Corban sacred funds, dedicated exclusively to God for the upkeep of the temple and the daily sacrificial system.
Using them for secular infrastructure, no matter how necessary, was absolute sacrilege. It was literally theft from the divine.
So the people staged massive protests in Jerusalem, and Pilate's response was brutal.
Highly brutal. He didn't invite their leaders to the governor's palace to negotiate.
No.
He ordered his soldiers to dress in civilian clothes, hide clubs and daggers under their tunics, and infiltrate the crowd of protesters. On his signal, they started bludgeoning and stabbing the unarmed civilians, resulting in a horrific massacre.
It demonstrated a complete reliance on violence over diplomacy. But Pilate's heavy-handed tactics kind of pale in comparison to the crisis provoked by Emperor Caligula just a few years later, in 39 CE, right?
Oh, definitely. Caligula, who demanded to be worshipped as a living god across the empire, issued an edict that nearly ignited a full-scale war decades before the actual revolt.
He ordered the Roman governor of Syria to take legions down to Jerusalem and install a massive gilded statue of Caligula, depicted as the god Zeus, directly inside the Holy of Holies.
It is hard to overstate how catastrophic this order was. Putting a statue of a Roman emperor in the temple wasn't just offensive. It was an existential threat to the entire religion.
The response from the local population was immediate, but interestingly, it wasn't a violent uprising.
No, it was actually one of the largest recorded acts of nonviolent civil disobedience in the ancient world.
Right. Tens of thousands of Jewish farmers and citizens in the Galilee region left their fields, marched to where the Roman governor Petronius was stationed, and effectively went on a massive agricultural strike.
They presented themselves to Petronius and declared that they would bare their necks and allow his legions to slaughter them all before they would permit the temple to be desecrated.
And they also refused to plant the season's crops.
Which put Petronius in an impossible position. If the fields weren't planted, the region would suffer famine, bandits would proliferate, and tax revenues would plummet.
Petronius recognized that carrying out the emperor's order would require the extermination of the entire province.
So he actually delayed the order. He wrote letters back to Rome, trying to stall Caligula, risking his own life in the process.
And the only thing that prevented a total bloodbath was the fact that Caligula was assassinated by his own guards in 41 CE before the statue could be installed.
But think about the psychological damage there. The Roman authorities now firmly viewed the Jewish population as stubborn, irrational, and highly seditious.
And the Jewish population viewed the Romans as a chaotic, idolatrous force that could at any moment try to eradicate their faith.
Exactly. And alongside these cultural and religious collisions, we have to analyze the severe socioeconomic strain tearing the province apart from the inside.
Because following the transition to direct Roman rule, the traditional Judean economy, which had been largely based on small, independent subsistence farming, was forcibly integrated into the massive, hyper-commercialized Mediterranean market system.
And integrating into a global market sounds great on paper if you are a wealthy merchant. But the reality for the average Judean farmer was a nightmare.
The sources point to a crushing double taxation burden.
Yes. Put yourself in the shoes of a local farmer. You were forced to pay the heavy Roman imperial taxes on your land, taxes on your produce, toll taxes on the roads.
All to fund an occupying army you despise.
Right. And on top of that, you are still religiously obligated to pay the traditional tithes to the temple in Jerusalem to support the priesthood.
This relentless systemic pressure squeezed the middle and lower classes to the breaking point. When a bad harvest hit, or when the tax collectors, the publicani, demanded immediate payment in silver rather than grain, the small landowners had no choice but to take out loans.
And the lenders were almost exclusively the wealthy, aristocratic Jewish elite, primarily composed of the Sadducee faction.
The Sadducees are crucial to understand here, right? They controlled the high priesthood, they managed the massive wealth of the temple, and they were deeply entrenched in the Roman status quo.
Because collaborating with the Roman governors secured their own local authority and vast estates.
So when those impoverished farmers inevitably defaulted on their high-interest loans, their ancestral lands were foreclosed on and confiscated by the Sadducee elites.
Exactly. The farmers were then forced to work as day laborers on the very land their families had owned for generations.
Or they were driven into crowded cities like Jerusalem, joining a massive landless underclass. Contemporary sources describe a society rapidly dividing into a small, hyper-wealthy aristocracy and a massive, desperate proletariat ripe for revolution. I want to focus on that class divide for a second, because I think history classes often frame the First Jewish-Roman War entirely as a religious conflict, a battle over theology, monotheism, and the sanctity of the temple. But reading through these sources, I keep coming back to a modern analogy.
Okay, what is the analogy?
It feels like a hostile corporate takeover.
Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Well, imagine Rome is a massive multinational conglomerate that executes a hostile takeover of a smaller regional company, which is Judea. Rome immediately appoints the local executives, the Sadducees, as middle management. These executives are given massive bonuses, stock options, and total local authority, provided they keep the workers in line and ensure the quarterly profits the taxes keep flowing to the parent company in Rome.
Okay, I follow you.
But on the factory floor, the workers are getting crushed. Their pay is slashed, their benefits are revoked, and they are forced into endless overtime just to feed their families. Eventually, those workers aren't just going to strike against the parent company in Rome. They are going to direct their absolute deepest hatred toward their own executives who sold them out.
That is a highly apt way to frame it.
Looking at the evidence, this impending war is as much a violent class rebellion by the poor against the rich as it is a religious war against foreign occupation.
The historical record heavily supports that interpretation. The historian Josephus, who provides our primary account of these wars, belonged to the wealthy priestly aristocracy himself.
Right, so he has a bias.
Very much so. He frequently dismisses the rebels as mere brigands, robbers, or religious fanatics. But modern socioeconomic analysis of the conflict reveals that their radical revolutionary factions, like the Sicarii and the Zealots, drew their immense popularity directly from the impoverished lower classes.
They gained support not just through religious fervor, but by explicitly promising an end to the crushing debt, Roman taxation, and aristocratic exploitation.
Right. The messianic hopes of divine intervention were deeply intertwined with a very earthly desire for wealth redistribution and social justice.
So we have an environment where the population is pushed to the absolute edge by economic ruin, profound religious humiliation, and a staggering wealth gap. The powder keg is packed tight.
Which moves us to the spark that ignited the First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Revolt, spanning from 66 to 73 CE.
The initial trigger in the summer of 66 CE looks eerily similar to the incident with Pontius Pilate, but it involves a far more abrasive and corrupt Roman procurator named Gessius Florus, right?
Yes, Florus demanded 17 talents from the temple treasury, claiming it was required to cover unpaid imperial tribute.
And the local population had just had enough. They poured into the streets, protesting loudly, and they began mocking Florus openly. Some people even passed around a basket pretending to take up a charity collection for the poor, destitute Roman governor.
Florus did not find the joke amusing. In retaliation for the mockery, he did not deploy plainclothes soldiers like Pilate. He marched a cohort of heavily armed Roman legionaries into the upper market of Jerusalem.
And he gave them free rein to plunder the market, break into private homes, and slaughter anyone they found.
They murdered approximately 3,600 civilians, including women and children.
But Florus took it a step further to inflict maximum humiliation, didn't he? He arrested several prominent Jewish citizens who had actually attained Roman equestrian rank. Wait, let me stop here for a second to clarify. When we say equestrian rank, we aren't just talking about a cavalryman who rides a horse, right?
No, the equestrian order was the second highest social and property class in Roman society, just below the senatorial class. It indicated immense wealth, high social standing, and deep integration into the Roman administrative system. By having Jewish men of equestrian rank publicly scourged with whips and then crucified, Florus was sending a terrifying message.
He was demonstrating that no matter how wealthy you were, no matter how much you assimilated into Roman culture or collaborated with the administration, in the eyes of Rome, you were still just a conquered provincial subject without any real rights.
That brutality shattered the illusion that collaboration provided safety. The moderate voices in Jerusalem, the elites who had always advocated for peace and accommodation with Rome, suddenly lost all their credibility.
The momentum swung violently to the radical factions, and the pivotal point-of-no-return moment came from a man named Eleazar ben Hananiah, who was the captain of the temple guard.
Yes, he made the monumental decision to formally halt the daily sacrifices that were offered on behalf of the Roman emperor and the Roman people.
We cannot understate the significance of that act. In the ancient world, discontinuing those sacrifices was the diplomatic equivalent of declaring independence.
It was a formal, public rejection of Roman sovereignty over Judea.
And what the rebels did immediately after declaring independence validates the corporate takeover analogy completely. They stormed the Antonia fortress, wiping out the local Roman garrison. But then, one of their very first organized actions wasn't to build defenses.
No, they marched straight to the public archives in Jerusalem and burned the building to the ground.
They specifically targeted the archives to destroy the official debt records. If you are a landless peasant drowning in loans owed to the wealthy Sadducees, burning the archives is the ultimate financial reset button.
Exactly. It instantly strips the aristocracy of their financial leverage and their legal claims to the foreclosed lands. It was a highly effective, albeit destructive, tactical move to mobilize the massive underclass and lock them into the rebellion.
From day one, this was simultaneously a war for national liberation and a violent class revolution.
So the localized Roman administration completely collapses. The task of restoring order falls to Cestius Gallus, the Roman legate of the neighboring province of Syria.
He assembled a massive force centered around the 12th Legion, Legio XII Fulminata, along with thousands of allied troops numbering roughly 30,000 men.
He marched south, burned the northern suburbs of Jerusalem, and prepared to assault the Temple Mount to crush the rebellion before winter set in.
And then we encounter one of the great mysteries of military history. For reasons that are still debated by historians, Gallus abruptly abandoned the siege. He ordered his army to break camp and begin a full retreat back toward the coast. Wait, why? Did his supply lines fail? Did he suddenly get scared of the defenses?
Josephus claims it was a cowardly and irrational decision. Modern historians speculate that Gallus recognized his supply lines were dangerously thin, winter rains were approaching which would make roads impassable, and he perhaps underestimated the fanatical resolve of the defenders.
Right.
He likely decided a winter siege was too risky and planned to return in the spring. Regardless of his reasoning, the retreat proved fatal.
As the Roman column slowly marched back toward the coast, they had to pass through a narrow, winding, steep descent known as the Pass of Beth Horon.
The geography of Beth Horon was a death trap for a conventional Roman army. The legions relied on tight formations, flat ground, and heavy armor.
And in the steep, rocky confines of the pass, they were forced to stretch out into a long, vulnerable column.
Exactly. Judean irregular forces, lightly armed and highly mobile, swarmed the heights. They rained arrows, javelins, and boulders down on the trapped Romans.
The retreat turned into a catastrophic, panicked rout. The Roman army suffered staggering losses, over 100,000 soldiers killed. And to add the ultimate insult to the massive death toll, the Judean rebels captured the Eagle Standard of the 12th Legion.
Losing in Aquila, the Eagle Standard, was the profoundest military and spiritual disgrace a Roman legion could suffer. It represented the loss of the legion's honor and the emperor's divine favor.
The victory at Beth-horon had an electrifying psychological impact across Judea. It shattered the aura of Roman invincibility. It convinced many of the moderates who had been sitting on the fence that perhaps the radical zealots were right.
Perhaps God truly was fighting on their side, and the Roman Empire could actually be defeated.
But defeating a retreating column in a mountain pass is very different from defeating the full, mobilized machinery of the Roman Empire. When word of this humiliation reached Emperor Nero in Greece, he didn't send diplomats to negotiate a truce.
No, he called upon one of his most experienced, hardened, and ruthless commanders, General Vespasian, and he sent Vespasian's son, Titus, along as his second-in-command.
Their mandate was simple: pacify the province completely and totally.
Vespasian was a meticulous military strategist. He arrived in the region and assembled a juggernaut. He brought in 4 veteran legions, the 5th, 10th, 15th, and eventually the remnants of the 12th.
Along with a massive influx of auxiliary cohorts and cavalry provided by client kings. Wait, just to clarify for the listener, what is the practical difference between a legion and these auxiliary troops?
A Roman legion was composed of heavy infantry, roughly 5,000 men, all of whom were Roman citizens. They were the highly disciplined, heavily armored core of the military.
Okay, so what about the auxiliary?
The auxiliaries were non-citizen troops drawn from the provinces. They provided specialized roles: archers from Syria, slingers, light cavalry. Together, Vespasian commanded an expeditionary force of roughly 60,000 highly trained professional soldiers.
60,000 troops marching on a province the size of modern-day New Jersey. And Vespasian doesn't rush straight to Jerusalem to avenge Gallus, does he?
No, he takes his time. In 67 CE, he starts in the north, in the Galilee region, and he systematically, methodically destroys the rebel strongholds one by one.
He uses massive siege ramps, iron battering rams, and artillery. He enslaves entire populations, slaughters the men, and drives tens of thousands of terrified refugees fleeing south into the fortified walls of Jerusalem.
It was a deliberate strategy of attrition and terror. Vespasian was securing his supply lines and isolating the capital, turning Jerusalem into a massive, overcrowded refugee camp.
So, as this unstoppable Roman machine spends over a year, slowly grinding its way south, destroying everything in its path, you would assume the rebel forces inside Jerusalem are frantically preparing. You'd think they are stockpiling weapons, repairing the walls, establishing a unified command structure to face the impending apocalypse.
But that is not what they are doing.
No, what are they actually doing?
They're slaughtering each other. The situation inside Jerusalem devolved into a chaotic, incredibly bloody, multi-factional civil war.
It is genuinely maddening to read the sources on this. You have 3 primary warlords barricaded inside different sectors of the city: John of Gischala, Simon Bar Giora, and Eleazar ben Simon. Instead of turning their weapons on the Romans, they turn them on each other.
And the geography of the city exacerbated the conflict. Eleazar ben Simon controlled the inner court of the temple itself. John of Gischala controlled the wider Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress. Simon Bar Giora controlled the upper city.
They engaged in constant, brutal street-to-street fighting across the Tyropaean Valley that divided the city.
They utilized heavy Roman artillery ballistas and catapults captured during the rout of Cestius Gallus to rain fire and stones down upon their own people and rival factions.
If you are listening to this and wondering why on earth they would destroy themselves while an empire is marching to kill them, you aren't alone. It's like a group of sailors on a ship that has just struck an iceberg.
Right.
Water is flooding the lower decks, the ship is tilting, and instead of manning the pumps, the sailors draw swords and start hacking each other to pieces over who gets to wear the captain's hat, while simultaneously drilling more holes in the hull.
That is a fitting description, especially considering their next move.
Because the absolute most insane detail from this period is that in their struggle to assert dominance, these factions deliberately set fire to their own city's massive food storehouses.
It represents one of the most profound strategic failures in military history. The wealthy citizens and the temple administration had spent years stockpiling immense quantities of grain, dried figs, and other provisions. The city theoretically possessed enough food to withstand a Roman siege for years.
But the rebel leaders purposefully burned these granaries to ash. Why? What is the possible tactical logic in burning your own food supply during a siege?
There are a few theories. Some historians argue it was a desperate tactic by the Zealots to force the moderate, pacifist civilian population into fighting. If there is no food, your only option is to fight your way out or starve.
That is ruthless.
Other scholars suggest it was simply a scorched earth tactic used against rival factions, denying resources to John so Simon could gain the upper hand, for example. But I want to address your earlier point. Why did they fail to unite?
Right, because it wasn't just a unified desire to get rid of Rome.
Exactly. They failed to unite because they possessed fundamentally incompatible visions for the future. Some factions were driven by apocalyptic messianism. They believed that if they purified the city through bloodshed, God would physically intervene with an army of angels to destroy the Romans.
And the others.
Other factions were driven by the socio-economic revolution we discussed, intent on massacring the wealthy elite and redistributing property. They lacked a singular, charismatic leader who could forge a coalition. Their ideological hatred for one another was so intense that they perceived their Jewish rivals across the street as a more immediate threat than the 60,000 Roman soldiers marching toward their gates.
So by the time Vespasian leaves to become emperor in Rome and hands command over to his son Titus, who arrives at the walls of Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE, the city is already a nightmare of starvation and violence.
And Titus timed his arrival perfectly. He arrived just before the festival of Passover, when pilgrims from all over the region had managed to slip into the city, artificially swelling the population to unmanageable levels.
Titus immediately moved to seal the trap. He ordered his legions to construct a wall of circumvallation.
Break down circumvallation for us, because this wasn't just a few guards standing around the city.
No, it is a massive feat of military engineering. The Roman legions stripped the surrounding countryside of all timber for miles. They built a continuous trench and a wooden palisade wall that entirely encircled Jerusalem. It was punctuated by fortified watchtowers.
The objective was absolute containment. Nothing goes in, no one comes out.
Titus intended to let the agonizing mechanics of mass starvation weaken the defenders before he risked his infantry in a direct assault on the towering stone walls of the city.
The conditions inside that circumvallation wall became literal hell on earth. The sources describe people combing the sewers for scraps, eating the leather off their sandals, chewing on old hay, and even dung.
If you were desperate enough to sneak out of the city at night into the surrounding valleys to scavenge for wild roots or herbs, you were almost always caught by Roman patrols.
And Titus ordered that anyone caught outside the walls be tortured and crucified in full view of the defenders. Josephus, who was actually serving as an interpreter for the Romans outside the walls at this point, reports that the soldiers were crucifying up to 500 Jews a day.
They mailed them in mocking postures, utilizing every available tree until, as you mentioned in the introduction, the region was entirely deforested. The psychological pressure applied to the city was relentless.
But the most haunting vignette that Josephus records doesn't happen outside the walls. It happens inside, illustrating the absolute madness induced by starvation.
Right.
He documents the story of a wealthy woman named Mary of Bethzeba. She had fled to Jerusalem for safety, but the rebel factions, driven mad by hunger themselves, constantly raided her house, stealing whatever hidden morsels of food she had left.
And driven completely insane by starvation and despair, she killed her own infant son, roasted his body, and ate half of it.
When the rebel looters smelled cooking meat, they broke down her door and demanded she hand over the food. She calmly uncovered the remains of her child and offered it to them.
Even these hardened, blood-soaked rebels fled the house in sheer terror. When rumors of this cannibalism reached the Roman camps, Titus publicly declared that a city where mothers ate their own children was cursed by the gods and deserved nothing short of total annihilation.
By the summer, the relentless pounding of the Roman battering rams finally breached the first and second outer walls. The fighting became a grueling, grinding urban slog, pushing inward toward the Antonia fortress and finally to the massive defensive perimeter of the Temple Mount itself.
The defenders, despite being starved and exhausted, fought with a fanatical, desperate courage. They engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat, launching counterattacks and even managing to set Roman siege engines on fire.
But the sheer numerical superiority and disciplined engineering of the legions were insurmountable.
Finally, in August of 70 CE, on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, a date that remains a day of mourning and fasting in Judaism today, the Roman forces breached the inner sanctum.
According to Josephus, Titus actually wanted to capture the magnificent temple intact. perhaps to turn it into a Roman shrine or just to claim it as an architectural trophy.
But a Roman soldier, either acting in the chaos of battle or out of sheer hatred, threw a burning piece of timber through a golden window into the sanctuary.
The dry timber and rich tapestries inside caught fire immediately. The flames quickly consumed the structure. The Roman troops, enraged by the long, brutal siege, lost all discipline.
They massacred everyone. They found rebels, priests, unarmed civilians, children, until the blood literally flowed down the steps of the Temple Mount.
The destruction was absolute. The Romans looted the vast remaining treasures of the temple, including the massive golden menorah, which was carried back to Rome and paraded through the streets in a grand triumph, an event immortalized in stone on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome today.
They razed the city of Jerusalem to the ground, leaving only a section of the western wall and 3 towers standing as a stark monument to the strength of the legions that conquered it.
The surviving population was enslaved, sent to die in the gladiatorial arenas of the empire, or condemned to brutal labor in Egyptian mines.
The physical landscape of Judea was decimated. But as we transition into the aftermath, we have to examine the psychological and theological landscape, which was equally shattered.
Because the burning of the temple created a profound spiritual void, leading to one of the most critical paradigm shifts in human history. The transition from temple to Torah.
Right, because it's not just that they lost a beautiful building. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, you have to understand that Second Temple Judaism wasn't just a religion of belief. It was a religion of physical mechanics. The entire system was centered around the korbanot, the sacrificial cult.
Correct. The sacrifices, the daily offerings of lambs, the grain offerings, the massive sacrifices during the pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, these were the literal mechanisms by which the nation maintained its covenant with God.
The blood on the altar was the required avenue for atonement, for expressing gratitude, and for maintaining the ritual purity of the community.
The temple was not just a synagogue. It was perceived as the geographic axis mundi, the literal dwelling place of the divine presence, the Shekinah on earth.
So when that engine is completely destroyed, the vehicle stops running. If you believe your God requires sacrifices at this one specific altar to forgive your sins, and that altar is now a pile of smoking rubble guarded by Roman legionaries, what do you do?
That is the existential crisis that would have permanently ended almost any other ancient religion. In the ancient Mediterranean, deities were deeply tied to geography. When a city fell and its temple burned, it was proof that the local god had been defeated by the conqueror's god.
The cult simply ceased to exist.
Exactly, the believers assimilated.
But our sources highlight a pivotal narrative vignette about a sage, a Pharisaic rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai, that explains how this culture managed to rewrite its own operating system while the city was literally burning around them.
According to rabbinic tradition, during the height of the horrific factional infighting and starvation of the siege, Yohanan ben Zakkai recognized that Jerusalem was completely doomed.
The Zealots were destroying the city from within, and the Romans would finish the job from without.
He realized a profound truth. If the religion remained exclusively tethered to the stones of the temple and the blood of the sacrifices, the religion would die with the temple. It had to adapt or it would vanish.
But he's trapped inside a city controlled by paranoid zealots who are executing anyone who tries to surrender. So he comes up with a desperate plan to escape.
He faked his own severe illness and subsequent death. His closest disciples placed him in a burial shroud and laid him in a coffin. They carried the coffin to the gates of the besieged city, telling the zealot guards they were simply fulfilling the religious obligation to bury a corpse outside the city walls.
The guards, fearing ritual impurity, let them pass.
Once he is safely outside the walls and past the Roman lines, he emerges from the coffin and manages to secure an audience directly with the Roman commander, Vespasian.
And the request he makes to Vespasian is fascinating because of what he does not ask for.
Right. He does not ask Vespasian to spare Jerusalem. He does not ask him to save the temple. He knew those requests were impossible. Instead, he asked for something that seemed entirely insignificant to a Roman general.
He asks for permission to establish a small, quiet academy for scholars in a coastal town called Yavne.
Vespasian, who likely viewed a group of unarmed, bearded scholars studying texts as completely harmless compared to the violent zealots he was fighting, granted the request.
And that tiny, seemingly insignificant academy in Yavne becomes the crucible for one of the most successful cultural adaptations in human history.
At Yavne, Yohanan ben Zakkai and the surviving sages began the monumental task of restructuring Judaism so that it could survive without a centralized, physical temple, without an altar, and without the Sadducean priesthood, who largely fade into historical irrelevance after the destruction of their power base.
This is the birth of Rabbinic Judaism, and I want to use an analogy here to frame the sheer scale of this pivot.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine the religion of Second Temple Judaism as an early, massive, centralized mainframe computer. Everything requires you to physically travel to the mainframe in Jerusalem to input your data, your sacrifices to keep the system running.
Okay, I follow.
When the Romans blew up the mainframe, the religion should have crashed permanently. But what Yohanan ben Zakkai and the rabbis at Yavne did was essentially invent cloud computing for theology.
That is a highly effective way to visualize the transition.
They took the core data, the code of the religion, and they decentralized it. They told the people, you don't need to go to the mainframe anymore. You can run the software locally on your own hardware wherever you are in the world.
And how did they rewrite that software? They systematically reinterpreted the core requirements of the faith. When the people mourned the loss of the sacrifices, asking how they could ever achieve atonement, Yohanan ben Zakkai quoted the prophet Hosea, declaring that God desires loving kindness, not sacrifice.
The rabbis established that the obligations previously fulfilled by the blood of animals could now be fulfilled through specific, portable actions.
Yes, they replaced the smoke of the altar with the breath of prayer.
Precisely. The standardized daily prayers, specifically the Amidah, were instituted to directly correspond to the times of the daily sacrifices in the destroyed temple.
The rigorous intellectual study of the Torah was elevated. Debating the law became a form of worship equal to, or even greater than, offering a sacrifice. The local synagogue, which had been a secondary institution, was elevated to become the new, decentralized hub of community life.
They made the religion entirely portable. You don't need a massive stone temple managed by an aristocratic priesthood anymore. You just need a Torah scroll, 10 people to form a minyan, and you can practice the faith in Rome, in Alexandria, in Babylonia, or anywhere else on the planet.
By shifting the focus from a vulnerable geographic location to an indestructible textual tradition, they essentially immunized the culture against total erasure.
It was a theological framework explicitly designed for survival in the diaspora. And while the scholars in Yavne were quietly, meticulously rebuilding the intellectual architecture of the faith, we cannot forget the millions of Jews living outside of Judea.
Because they had just watched the Roman Empire burn their spiritual center to ash, enslave their brethren, and impose a humiliating punitive tax, the fiscus judaicus, on every Jew in the empire, directing the funds to the temple of Jupiter in Rome.
You cannot inflict that level of trauma and humiliation without consequences. The resentment was a ticking time bomb.
And roughly 45 years later, that bomb went off. Which brings us to the Kitos War, also known as the Diaspora Revolt, spanning from 115 to 117 CE.
This is a massive multi-front conflict that is frequently overshadowed by the wars in Judea, but it was incredibly destructive. And it was triggered by a specific geopolitical opening, wasn't it?
Yes. In 115 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan launched a massive, ambitious invasion of the Parthian Empire in the east, in what is now Iraq and Iran.
Why is Trajan in Parthia, and why does that matter for this revolt?
Parthia was Rome's great rival, a powerful empire that controlled the vital Silk Road trade routes. Trajan wanted to crush them and expand Roman territory to the Persian Gulf. To execute this massive campaign, he pulled crack legions and auxiliary cohorts from all over the eastern Mediterranean.
He concentrated the empire's military might in Mesopotamia.
Exactly, which means he drained the garrisons in places like Egypt, Cyrenaica in North Africa, and the island of Cyprus. He left the back door wide open.
The Jewish populations in those regions saw a sudden power vacuum. But the Kitos War wasn't just anti-Roman. It was deeply intertwined with long-standing, bitter ethnic tensions.
Yes, cities like Alexandria in Egypt and Cyrene in North Africa were heavily populated Hellenistic cities. For decades, the Greek and Jewish populations had been engaged in violent civic disputes over political rights, taxation, and cultural dominance.
When the Roman garrisons left, those local ethnic powder kegs exploded into outright war.
The uprisings were decentralized, lacking a single unified commander like we see later, but they were staggeringly violent. In Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya, a leader named Lucullus, sometimes referred to in Greek sources as Andreas, led a massive rebellion.
They didn't just attack the remaining Roman administrative centers, they engaged in widespread cultural destruction.
Systematically tearing down pagan temples dedicated to gods like Apollo, Artemis, and Hecate, and destroying Roman civic structures like baths and basilicas.
The violence spread rapidly. From Cyrenaica, the rebellion spilled eastward into Egypt. The Jewish rebels engaged the Greek population in brutal, block-by-block urban warfare in Alexandria, effectively destroying large sections of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world.
In Cyprus, a leader named Artemion led an uprising that completely devastated the island, particularly the capital city of Salamis. Simultaneously, Jewish communities in Mesopotamia rose up behind Trajan's lines, directly threatening the supply routes for his Parthian campaign.
Now, when we look at the primary sources for this conflict, we run into some truly shocking descriptions. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing about a century after the events, claims that the Jewish rebels committed horrific, almost cartoonish atrocities.
He does. He writes that they ate the flesh of their Greek and Roman victims, made belts out of their entrails, sawed people in half, and smeared themselves with blood.
And the death tolls, he reports, are astronomical. 220,000 Greeks and Romans slaughtered in Cyrenaica and 240,000 killed in Cyprus.
But we have to apply strict critical analysis to those numbers and descriptions. It is highly probable that Cassius Dio's figures are vastly exaggerated.
I want to push back on that because as a casual reader of history, if a primary source says 240,000 people died, why shouldn't I believe that's a historical record?
That is a fair point.
How much of these lurid tales of cannibalism and these massive demographic death tolls should be viewed as factual history versus Roman senatorial propaganda designed to justify the absolute eradication of these communities?
That is the essential question to ask when reading ancient sources. Roman historians frequently inflated casualty numbers to emphasize the severity of a crisis facing the empire, or to magnify the glory of the generals who eventually suppressed the rebellion.
Right, they want to make the threat look as big as possible.
Furthermore, Dio's graphic descriptions of cannibalism and making belts of intestines fit perfectly into standard Roman literary tropes used to dehumanize rebellious provincial populations. By portraying the Jewish rebels not as political insurgents fighting for civic rights, but as irrational, barbaric, bloodthirsty monsters, it rhetorically justified whatever extreme violence the Romans used to crush them.
It makes it much easier to justify wiping an entire population off the map if you convince the Senate they are literal flesh-eating monsters.
Exactly. Now, this critical reading does not mean we minimize the severity of the conflict. The archaeological evidence provides undeniable proof of the scale of the destruction. In Cyrene, we have found Roman inscriptions detailing the rebuilding of roads and temples that were torn up and destroyed in the Jewish tumult.
So the violence was very real, very bloody, and perpetrated by both sides.
But Dio's specific numbers of nearly 500,000 dead civilians are likely rhetorical tools rather than accurate demographic facts.
Whatever the true casualty numbers were, the Roman response was a campaign of near total annihilation. Trajan could not afford to lose control of Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. If the grain shipments from Alexandria to Rome stopped, the city of Rome would riot and starve.
So Trajan immediately redirected his top military commanders to suppress the uprisings. He sent a trusted general, Marcius Turbo, with a massive combined land and naval force to pacify Egypt and Cyrenaica. Turbo employed ruthless, scorched earth tactics.
Simultaneously, Trajan deployed Lucius Quietus, a brilliant and notoriously brutal Moorish cavalry commander, to crush the uprisings in Mesopotamia and subsequently march into Judea to secure the region.
The suppression was systematic and merciless. The result was the functional eradication of the Jewish communities in Egypt and Cyrenaica. The ancient, thriving, deeply influential Jewish population of Alexandria, a community that had produced immense philosophical and literary works, was virtually wiped out.
And in Cyprus, the Roman retaliation was permanent and codified into law, wasn't it?
Yes. After Roman forces crushed the rebellion under Artemion, the Roman administration issued a perpetual edict banning any Jewish person from ever setting foot on the island of Cyprus again.
The sources state that this law was enforced so strictly that even if a Jewish traveler were shipwrecked by a storm and washed ashore on Cyprus, they would be executed immediately.
The Kitos War effectively destroyed the major Jewish centers of the Hellenistic diaspora. It was a demographic and cultural catastrophe. The remaining populations in these regions were scattered or enslaved.
But the failure of this widespread, multi-front, decentralized revolt set the stage for one final, highly organized, and desperate stand back in the homeland of Judea.
Which brings us to the climax of the Jewish-Roman Wars. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, lasting from 132 to 136 CE. The diaspora has been crushed, The province of Judea has been relatively quiet for decades, while the rabbis at Yavna did their work.
But the Roman Emperor Hadrian makes a series of decisions that throws a match directly into the remaining powder keg.
Around 130 CE, Emperor Hadrian conducts a grand tour of the eastern provinces, including Judea. Hadrian was deeply obsessed with Greek culture and wanted to unify his empire under a shared Hellenistic identity, a concept known as the Panhellenian.
As part of this vision, he decides to completely refound the ruined city of Jerusalem, which had been lying in debris since Titus destroyed it 60 years earlier. But he doesn't rebuild it as a Jewish city. He rebuilds it as a Roman pagan colony, naming it Aelia Capitolina.
Naming it Aelia after his own family name, Aelius and Capitolina, after the Capitoline triad of Roman gods. He laid out standard Roman grid streets, built Roman baths, and most provocatively, he ordered the construction of a massive grand temple dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the exact, precise site of the destroyed Jewish Temple Mount.
For the local Jewish population, this was the ultimate final desecration. For 60 years, they had prayed daily for the rebuilding of their temple. Hadrian building a shrine to Jupiter on that specific holy ground was a permanent signal that their hopes for restoration were dead. The Roman occupation was meant to be eternal.
And Hadrian compounded this architectural provocation with a devastating legal edict. He issued an empire-wide ban on all forms of genital mutilation, which explicitly included the practice of circumcision.
From Hadrian's Hellenistic perspective, the physical human body was a perfect aesthetic form, and altering it through circumcision was a barbaric, repulsive practice akin to castration. He thought he was simply outlawing a primitive custom to civilize the empire.
But he failed to comprehend the theological weight of the act. For the Jewish people, the Brit Milah circumcision is not a cultural custom. It is the fundamental, non-negotiable physical sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people, tracing back to Abraham.
Banning it was not just an administrative law, it was an attempt to outlaw the very biological continuation of Jewish identity.
So the population is backed into an absolute corner where accommodation is impossible and fighting is the only option left to maintain their identity. But unlike the chaotic, self-destructive, multi-factional Great Revolt we talked about earlier, this rebellion is entirely different in its execution.
Right, it is fiercely unified under one highly charismatic, deeply authoritarian leader, Simon Bar Kokhba, who becomes known as Simon Bar Kokhba.
Bar Kokhba was a brilliant, pragmatic military commander and a ruthless administrator. He took the title Nasi Israel, meaning prince or president of Israel. But what truly cemented his total authority over the population was the spiritual endorsement he received.
Rabbi Akiva, one of the most prominent, brilliant, and revered sages in all of Jewish history, a leading figure in the development of the Mishnah, publicly proclaimed that Simon Bar Kokhba was the long-awaited Messiah.
We have to pause and absorb how massive that endorsement is. When a figure of Akiva's stature calls you the Messiah, he isn't just saying you are a capable general. He is declaring that you are the prophesied, anointed Davidic king who has been ordained by God to destroy the Roman Empire and usher in an era of global redemption and peace.
That declaration infuses the entire military campaign with absolute, unshakable religious certainty.
It electrified the population, drawing massive numbers of recruits who believed they were fighting in the final apocalyptic war. However, it is vital to note that this intense messianic fervor was not universally accepted by all the scholars.
Oh, definitely not. The Talmud records a sharp, sarcastic dissent from another prominent sage, Rabbi Yohanan ben Torta. When Akiva made his declaration, ben Torta famously replied, "Akiva, grass will grow on your cheeks and the Messiah will not yet have come."
He's essentially telling Akiva that he is delusional, and that they will all be dead and buried, with grass growing over their graves, long before the actual Messiah arrives.
He recognized the geopolitical suicide of fighting Rome again. But Ben Torta's realism was drowned out by the fervor. The population rallied behind Bar Kokhba, and their preparation for this war was incredibly sophisticated and secretive.
They studied the catastrophic failures of the First Revolt. They knew they could not defeat the Roman legions in pitched, open field battles, and they knew they could not hold massive, walled cities against Roman siege engineering and battering rams.
So what did they do?
Instead, over a period of several years, they quietly prepared a vast, complex network of underground tunnel systems and fortified caves throughout the limestone and chalk hills of the Judean countryside.
This wasn't just hiding in natural caves. This was massive subterranean engineering. They carved narrow, twisting shafts designed specifically so that a Roman legionary wearing heavy armor and carrying a wide shield couldn't easily navigate them.
They incorporated ancient water cisterns for hydration, carved small ventilation shafts for air, and stockpiled massive caches of weapons and dried food.
When the revolt finally launched in 132 CE, it was a masterclass in asymmetrical guerrilla warfare. They ambushed Roman patrols on the roads, utilized swift hit-and-run tactics, and then vanished back into their hidden tunnel networks.
The local Roman garrisons were completely overwhelmed by an enemy they could barely see. The rebels were so successful initially that they completely drove the Roman legions out of the Judean heartland and actually established an independent Jewish state that lasted for over 3 years.
And we have extraordinary archaeological evidence confirming the administrative sophistication of this brief independent state. They didn't just fight, they governed. They minted their own independent coins to replace Roman currency.
The numismatic evidence is fascinating. Because they lacked the infrastructure to mint coins from scratch, they took existing Roman silver denarii and bronze coins, coins featuring the faces of Trajan and Hadrian, and they systematically filed them down and overstruck them with Jewish symbols.
They stamped them with images of a lyre, a palm tree, or the facade of the destroyed temple, along with slogans in Paleo-Hebrew script reading for the freedom of Jerusalem or year one of the redemption of Israel.
Think about the psychological impact of that. Every time you buy bread, you are handling a piece of metal that literally erases the Roman emperor's face and replaces it with a declaration of your own freedom.
We also have actual letters written by Bar Kokhba himself, discovered by archaeologists like Yigal Yadin in the Cave of Letters near the Dead Sea. These letters show a commander who is managing logistics down to the finest detail.
Right, ordering grain shipments, punishing troops who don't follow orders, and remarkably, demanding that his soldiers strictly observe the Sabbath.
And requesting specific palm branches and citrons be sent to his camp so his men can properly celebrate the festival of Sukkot during the war.
It demonstrates a highly organized, religiously devout military administration. But the Roman Empire could not tolerate a province successfully seceding. The loss of tax revenue and the blow to imperial prestige were unacceptable.
Hadrian realized the local governors were losing, so he deployed the ultimate Roman sledgehammer. He recalls his absolute best, most experienced general, Sextus Julius Severus, all the way from the province of Britain.
And Hadrian doesn't just send reinforcements. He sends an overwhelming tsunami of military force. Severus assembles an expeditionary force of up to 12 legions, augmented by massive numbers of auxiliary cohorts drawn from across the empire.
We are looking at a deployment of perhaps 120,000 Roman troops. To put that scale into perspective, that represents a massive percentage of the entire Roman military apparatus concentrated on one tiny, rebellious province.
And Severus is smart. He refuses to play Bar Kokhba's guerrilla game. He knows if he marches his legions into the hills, they will get ambushed and chopped to pieces.
So how does he counter the tunnel networks?
He employs a relentless, agonizing war of attrition and counterinsurgency. He utilizes circumvallation again, building walls and forts around known Jewish strongholds and cave systems to completely cut off their access to food and water.
When the Romans located a tunnel entrance, they didn't send soldiers down to fight hand-to-hand in the dark. They used smoke to suffocate the rebels underground. They used specially trained dogs to sniff out ventilation shafts.
They even used early acoustic detection, having soldiers put their ears to the ground to listen for digging and then dropping burning pitch or sulfur down the shafts. They systematically hunted them down like animals.
Alongside the subterranean warfare, Severus enacted a brutal scorched earth policy across the surface. His legions systematically destroyed every crop, chopped down every fruit tree, and razed hundreds of villages to the ground to deny the rebels any sustenance or cover.
The grueling campaign culminated in 135 CE at the heavily fortified town of Beitar, which served as Bar Kokhba's final headquarters. After a brutal, agonizing siege, the Roman engineering broke through the defenses.
The slaughter inside Beitar was absolute. Simon of Bar Kokhba was killed, though the exact circumstances of his death are unclear, and the organized military resistance was permanently broken.
The human cost of this war is almost unfathomable. Cassius Dio estimates that 580,000 Jewish fighters were killed in combat, and that staggering number does not include the countless hundreds of thousands of civilians who died from starvation, disease, or fire during the Scorched Earth campaign.
50 fortified towns and nearly 1,000 villages were completely wiped off the map. Judea was left an absolute desolate wasteland.
But the Romans paid a massive bloody price as well. The guerrilla war was incredibly lethal for the heavy infantry. It is highly likely that the 22nd Legion, Legio Texii Dioteriana, was completely destroyed during this conflict, as it vanishes from the Roman historical records entirely after this date.
Other legions suffered such catastrophic losses that when Hadrian finally reported the victory to the Roman Senate, he pointedly omitted the standard expected opening phrase. If you and your children are in health, it is well. I and the legions are in health. He could not claim the army was well.
The Bar Kokhba Revolt was the final, devastating chapter of these conflicts. And it brings us to a highly complex modern historical debate regarding how Simon Bar Kokhba should be remembered.
Right. And I want to be very clear that we are analyzing this strictly neutrally, looking at how historians interpret the primary sources without endorsing any modern political viewpoints. But the debate is fierce.
Yes, on one hand you have historians like Israel Eldad, who argue that Bar Kokhba should be remembered as a courageous, tragic hero. He defended Jewish ideals, fought for national freedom against impossible odds, and made a noble, defiant stand for sovereignty against a tyrannical empire that was trying to erase their culture.
On the other hand, you have scholars like Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who view Bar Kokhba as a catastrophic zealot. Harkabi argues that Bar Kokhba's authoritarianism and his messianic delusions caused him to ignore geopolitical reality.
By fighting a war he could never ultimately win against a superpower, he led a rebellion that was doomed to fail and ultimately brought unparalleled, entirely avoidable destruction and death upon his own people.
It is the classic historical debate. Is it better to fight for freedom and risk total annihilation, or to accommodate the oppressor to ensure physical survival? The sources allow you to argue it either way, but the reality of the aftermath is undeniable.
The immediate geopolitical results were absolute erasure. Hadrian was determined to ensure that a Jewish revolt would never, ever happen again. To punish the province, he formally renamed Judea to Syria-Palestina, reviving the name of the ancient Philistines specifically to intentionally sever and erase the Jewish historical and geographical connection to the land.
Furthermore, Jews were permanently banned by law from entering the new pagan city of Aelia Capitolina, built over the ruins of Jerusalem, except for one day a year, Tisha B'Av, where they had to pay a fee just to enter the city and mourn the destruction of the temple.
It marks the definitive end of Jewish political autonomy in the region for nearly 2 millennia. The surviving population was largely sold into massive slave markets in Hebron and Gaza, driving the price of slaves across the empire down to the price of a horse, or they fled, massively expanding the Jewish diaspora across the globe.
However, if we step back and connect this immense tragedy to the bigger picture, the enduring legacy of these three wars is not just destruction. It is arguably the greatest story of adaptation in human history.
The physical structures, the temple, the city, the farms were all gone. But the intellectual and theological frameworks established decades earlier at Yavne by Yohanan ben Zakkai ensured that the core of the culture survived the fire.
They shifted the entire paradigm of the religion from the sword and the sacrificial altar to the text, the law, and the prayer. They created a system of rabbinic Judaism that was incredibly resilient.
It could exist in a small community in Babylonia, in a village in medieval Spain, or in a modern city today, without ever needing a physical temple or geographic homeland to sustain its core practices.
The resilience of the diaspora stands as a testament to that adaptation. They lost the physical land, but they built a fortress of texts, debates, and traditions eventually compiled into the Talmud that no Roman legion could ever burn down.
Which brings us back to where we started today, looking at the forest of crosses outside Jerusalem. The empire that sought to completely erase this culture inadvertently catalyzed the exact transformation that allowed that culture to outlast Rome itself.
I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We look at the Roman destruction of the temple and the subsequent wars as profound historical tragedies, and the human cost was undeniably horrifically high. But consider how the physical destruction of a civilization center often acts as a brutal evolutionary filter. If the Romans had simply ignored the first rebellion, if Cestius Gallus had negotiated a peace, if the temple had never been destroyed by fire, would Judaism have remained a localized, archaic temple cult forever tethered to a single mountain in the Middle East? Or did the apocalyptic fire that consumed Jerusalem act as the necessary crucible that forced the religion to evolve into the globally influential text-based portable tradition it is today? Sometimes losing the building is the only way the foundation can spread across the entire world. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.